So it's 8 o'clock, and I don't see a lot of people still coming in. I would like to invite Jenny and Sharon to open their mic and their camera so we can see them, which is always a very warm welcome in the Netherlands.
Thank you.
Hello.
Hello. The one thing I really want to mention is you both work, I think, at the Heritage Futures Research Program, which is a research program looking into, the future of heritage, I think, right?
Yes.
And I thought of this great introduction, which I will give, but I want to give you the chance to introduce yourself. So Sharon, if I may invite you to say something about yourself and your research.
Okay, then, thank you very much, and thank you very much for this invitation in this kind of format where it's a little odd not seeing you as audience, but thank you for turning out this evening to come and listen. So yeah, so my name is Sharon Macdonald. This Heritage Futures Research Program is formally now over, but there's still so much for us to keep thinking about and talking about. I'm actually based primarily in Berlin. That's where I'm speaking from, where I'm a professor in an Institute of Europäische Ethnologie, and I set up a research center on museums and heritage here in Berlin.
So welcome, and I look very much forward to your talk together with Jenny Morgan. Jenny, you're at the other end of Europe, not in Berlin, but...
I am indeed. So I'm joining everybody tonight from Scotland. So thank you very much for the invitation to Sharon and I to come and speak to you today, and thank you everybody for joining us. So my name's Jenny Morgan. I'm a lecturer in heritage currently at the University of Stirling in Scotland, but really had the great pleasure of working with and collaborating with Sharon on the Heritage Futures project, and specifically the profusion theme that we're going to talk to you about tonight. So I'm really excited to be able to share a little glimpse into what we've been doing and thinking about.
All right, so my name is Arjen Dijkstra. I'm the director of the University Museum in Groningen. And as I always say, we have a great museum. It's really like a hidden treasure in the center of Groningen. But we even have a greater storage facility where we keep at any time about 99% of everything we've got. So that's a lot of objects that hardly ever are touched or seen by people. And we're always thinking about ways, how should we deal with that? So that's the first thing I wanted to say. And the second thing I really wanted to share with you is this nail. I'm not sure if you can, it's a common nail. I might use it to hang up something on my wall or not. I might bend it at a certain point and then I will throw it away. It has no real value to me, right? Here I have a second nail, which is clearly bent and which is also very rusty. I found this on the attic of a disbanded university in the north of the Netherlands, which was also the topic of my PhD research. And I'm very proud of this other nail, which on first glance may have less value, but which is one of my most proud possessions, I think. And it's a bit odd because the shiny, nice nail they both have no real value, right? But the one has no value for me and the other one, whereas at first glance, you might think it was differently. So I think this may be a theme you'll be addressing, not nails, obviously, but something like this. So I very much look forward to it. To the audience, we're going to listen to a talk for about 40 minutes, I think. Less, perhaps more, we'll see. But after that, there's room for questions, and I really want to invite you to ask some questions. You can do this by typing the questions in the chat. I will invite you to ask your questions with your video and audio on, so as a real question, which is nicest for everybody, I think. but this is after the entire presentation. So I now want to give the floor to you and take it away.
Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction, which absolutely goes to the heart of some of the things that we're going to talk about. So we're really looking forward to having a really nice discussion with you all. So we thought we'd begin with the word. So our title here, What to Keep, and a question here for museums. And this word keeping is, oh, sorry, I'm already whizzing ahead too much. This word keeping is, we think, quite like the Dutch word bewaren, and you can tell me how that should really be pronounced. Though I think it's quite similar to the German word bewahren. But it's also maybe subtly different, and we thought that's maybe something that we can talk about more in the discussion later. So this word keeping, to keep, it comes from Old English, meaning to retain or to hold in. So the building that you have, the main building of a castle, is called a keep. An item that you want to keep to preserve memory gets called a keepsake. And the person who's responsible for ensuring that the animals at the zoo are well cared for and that they don't escape is the keeper. And the same word is also quite often used in museums for the person who's responsible for certain collections of museum objects. So making sure they're cared for and that they don't run away. Increasingly, that's not the language used, but it is still used. So in this brief talk, what we want to do is to tell you just a little bit from that research, which we did mainly in the UK, looking at museum practices of keeping. Now, as was said, this was part of a bigger research program called Heritage Futures, which was looking broadly at the ways in which how we deal with heritage now shapes the kind of futures that we will have, and also thinking about what's done now to shape the heritage of the future. And we were working there on one of the themes, and this is the one called profusion. And we worked on that with our, so for part of the project, our colleague Harold Fredheim also worked on that, and he, among other things, actually carried out a survey of museum professionals looking at their views about the situation of collections in their museums. So the key question for this profusion theme was this one that we've written here. So in the face of a profusion of things, so the mass-produced things for mass consumption, what gets kept for the future? At least that's the question we began with, though in the end we didn't only look at mass-produced things, but also ended up looking more broadly, but that's where we began from. In using this word profusion, which is a slightly strange word, and it hasn't really had a sort of place in analysis so far as we're aware. We chose that because it doesn't especially have particularly positive or negative connotations. So words like, for example, excess and overload, they already have the sense that this is probably something bad or negative. Whereas profusion, with this dictionary sense here of abundance or a copious supply, a very large quantity, it's sort of fairly neutral, though it does have this sort of connotation of things that there's so much that things could pour or spill out from that. On which, to say a bit more about the project, I'll turn to Jenny.
Thanks, Sharon. Yeah, so thanks, Sharon, for introducing the kinds of research questions that, well, our primary research question that we wanted to explore through this this focus on profusion and this question about what gets kept for the future and what does not keep for the future. And to research this, we looked at both households and also museums. And it was a fairly small and ethnographic study, by which we mean that we tried to look really in quite in-depth ways and tried to remain as open as possible to what was actually going on within homes and museums grappling with profusion and making these decisions about what and what not to keep for the future. So, for example, we attended to the ways that things might make it into the future without them having been actively and self-consciously saved, perhaps just persisting, often in the home, for example, being put in a cupboard and forgotten about. Of course, we also paid attention to much more conscious and explicit forms of making decisions about what to keep for the future as well. Our research used a really broad and quite exciting for us as researchers mix of approaches for exploring this question. This included going, as I've said, into both homes and museums to talk to people and to observe what was actually happening, what's going on, how are they making these decisions, but also some quite creative ways of researching as well, including making short research films, undertaking, as we mentioned, a survey with UK museum professionals, helping to plan an exhibition based on the larger Heritage Futures research, which is still on display, I believe, at the Manchester Museum if travel ever opens up again and you're visiting the UK. And also holding creative knowledge exchange events. And we put this slide together really just to give you a bit of a visual snapshot of the diversity, its own kind of profusion, if you like, of our different research activities. One event that we ran that we think is worth mentioning because it's quite interesting was a creative knowledge exchange event where we actually invited museum curators and museum directors to meet with a professional declutterer. So declutterer is the English word for someone who goes into people's homes to help them organize, to help them store their things, and even sometimes get rid of possessions that perhaps are no longer wanted. So that was a really interesting event. Now, in terms of museums, and today in our brief talk, we are going to mainly focus on museums, it's perhaps just worth noting that our focus tended to be on those museums that collect everyday items from the present and also the recent past. And in the UK, which as Sharon has mentioned was our primary focus, although not only limited to the UK, this usually means museums or collections called social history. Now, as we started doing our research and visiting museums, one way that we found profusion to actually manifest, to be experienced within museums, was through the sheer quantity of things that museums are holding on to and keeping for the future. In the UK alone, there are around about 2,500 museums, and very conservative estimates say that they hold at least 200 million objects, and that approximately 90% of these 200 million objects are not on display but are in storage. And increasingly, collections are not only being stored within museums, such as in basement storage or other areas within museums, but in purpose-built warehouses like the one that you can see on the screen here, a museum depot, a purpose-built storage facility. These sometimes have dedicated study or research facilities and also might run public-facing initiatives like guided tours and open days. Indeed, I'd be really curious to know if any of our audience have been to any such events in museum storage facilities. But these warehouses, these depots, can also often be quite a long way from museums themselves, situated in quite different physical locations. I'll hand over to you now, Sharon. Oh, I think you're muted, Sharon.
I am indeed. So yeah, whether in those big out-of-town depots or in the basements of museums, what we typically encountered when we visited these were spaces that were very full, that they had lots of objects. Sometimes they're really crammed together, sometimes with quite a big range of different kinds of objects. And we also found that we ended up having interesting discussions with curators about different ways in which they might choose to display things, perhaps by size, and so to display things, to store things, perhaps sometimes by size, in order to maximize the number of objects that they could fit in there. So in many cases, the biggest part of those collections had come from times when there was not such a sense of space being limited, of space being scarce. And so we learned about how collecting was sometimes really done en masse in the past. So going in and just gathering up as much as possible of what was about to be thrown away. Say, for example, when a factory was being closed down, a shop was being shut, or perhaps a sense that a particular way of life was disappearing. So curators told us sometimes about what they called the indiscriminate collecting of the past, which employed a salvage approach, so just trying to save whatever it was possible to save. And we also learned about how collecting was not always done by careful decisions about what to actually decide to keep, but sometimes it was more haphazard and perhaps formed by donations, people actually giving things. So these very full storage spaces, and especially, I suppose, because not all of the objects are terribly small. Nails are a bit easier here than some of the bigger things. These really pose a challenge for keeping. So should they all be kept? Or should perhaps some make way for new things? And that was a question that was being asked. And as part of that, there was also questions raised about just how to care for all of these things. So curators told us, for example, about the difficulties that they sometimes faced with conservation. So, for example, plastics might deteriorate in problematic or even risky ways. Then there's the issue of cataloguing and finding out more information about not just about the new objects that are being collected, but also about what's already been kept. And we were told here about how there isn't always enough or the right kind of information there, so that they couldn't really be used in displays and things because there simply wasn't enough known about them in some of these cases. So very much in the face of these filling up stores, what we found is that quite a lot of museums had actually stopped doing contemporary collecting, or had very much scaled back and were really limiting that amount there. Oh, sorry, I think we both pressed it once.
So yeah, so here then, museums and those working in them also struggle, particularly we found, with deciding what should be collected. How do we know what are the right things to keep, particularly from our lives today, being able to say something in the future about how we're living our lives today. And this very much added to the sense that Sharon's been talking about, that perhaps there's simply too much that is already, but also could yet be acquired and held onto and kept for the future. And we're often given an example. You can see the image on the screen here of the mobile phone. This was an example that we were told about time and time again. Should we collect mobile phones, and how many different mobile phones should be collected? For example, if we're going with the iPhone, should museums acquire and keep every single model of iPhone that comes out, or perhaps just a selection? And if a selection, then how should curators identify what model? What would warrant a significant enough design or technological or aesthetic difference, perhaps? And so to sort of further illustrate the struggle with knowing what to keep, to say something about how we live our lives today and keeping the right things, we've just put one quote on the screen here from our research. It expresses very well the difficulties that some curators felt about the situation. And so I'll read the quote out because it's a rather nice one, we think. So this curator told us, "It's just so hard to know where to begin and to end. There's so much that we could collect and we could display, so many stories that we could tell. Already we have so much. Our storage is already filled to bursting point. But at the same time, we have a duty to future generations to try and show the way things are today." And what's really interesting about this quote is that it flags this issue of feeling very acutely a duty to future generations, a duty to collect the right things, and that curators are, in essence, trying to second guess what curators and audiences of the future generations, might actually want. And for some, we learned that the way to deal with this challenge, this struggle, is to try and collect as much as possible in case they miss something important, this feeling of gathering up as much as possible just in case it will be useful in the future. And this leads, though, into the next slide. And this was the idea that for others in our study, such an amassing of so much stuff or trying to collect as much as possible was really seen and considered as leaving too big a burden for the next generation. And perhaps also a querying of really this being rather an impossible task. And this is leading some museums to ask if it should all be kept. Do we need it all? And to look for strategies for doing what is sometimes called disposal, deaccession, or rationalisation. Now, collectively, these kinds of terms, such as disposal and deaccession, refer to processes of re-evaluating what has already been kept, looking back and re-evaluating, do we want to continue to keep hold of these items? And this can sometimes lead to the decision to let go or discard of things. Now, it is important to note that in the UK museums that we visited, this is a really carefully managed process. Letting go of any collection items, as curators were at pains to emphasise, primarily motivated not by space or storage constraints. Instead, it's used as an active form of collections management, a tool to help add value to what remains and to enhance the ability to further care for and use what has already been kept more effectively. It's perhaps also important for us to emphasise that despite, in English at least, the potential connotations of the word disposal perhaps making us think of chucking things out, destroying things, that it doesn't, in the majority of cases, certainly does not mean this. And that actually museum professionals really express to us, in many cases, a strong preference for using different kinds of words to perhaps better reflect how they show great care and effort when choosing exit routes for collection items in ways that might revive a no longer wanted or needed object's significance or use. So they expressed preference for different kinds of words, for example, removal or transfer. And often we would find that one of the ways that curators and museums would try to revive the use or significance of disposed objects was, for example, by giving these items to a different museum or finding another way to keep items in the public domain. And sometimes we learned even about quite creative strategies. For example, museums inviting artists to make exhibitions out of deaccessioned items, or museums giving no longer needed items to charities, such as the one that you can see on the slide here, for them to refurbish and redistribute disposed objects to communities for the learning of new skills. And this charity, Tools for Self-Reliance, actually has refurbished, disposed tools like sewing machines and hand tools from social history collections and then redistributed them to communities for the use in small starting up of small businesses. So I'll hand over to Sharon. You're on mute, Sharon.
Matter with me, I'm very good at normal times. Too late at night for me. Right. So alongside thinking about what might leave collections or be encouraged to go elsewhere, we also learned about how curators are often giving much closer scrutiny to what's being actually acquired, and thinking about, sometimes it's called assessment of significance, coming up with different ideas about how what should be collected, and so on. What we present here is a slide about that lists some of the reasons, so both values but also practicalities that shape museum keeping at present, according to our research. And should mention as well that in the fact that we did museum research and work with people in their homes, one of our interests is also in how those sometimes were crossed over and were the same, or sometimes they weren't. But it very much opens up the question, if we look at what is shaping it at the present, whether these are the right ones, and how might they be prioritized. So what, as a society, do we value, and what do we want to keep for the future? So we thought that we'd end our little input here by going back to your Dutch word, bewaren, and noting that it seems to be, and etymological dictionaries suggest this, linked to the English word for beware. So look out, or pas op. And that's something we think that as societies we certainly need to do as we decide what to keep, how much, and for how long. So thank you very much for your attention here, and we look forward very much to continuing a discussion with you.
Thank you very much. I'll applaud you. I'll be the only one audible, but many thanks. For me as a museum director, you touched on so many things I recognize from my day-to-day practices, obviously. And let me start by something which is a fun fact, and which is a complete coincidence, but today is exactly the 20th anniversary of our storage facility, of our depot, as we call it. So this morning in our work meeting, we discussed it, and 20 years ago, our storage facility was opened before the board of the university, the director of the Groningen Museum, you may have heard of, which is a famous museum in the northern part of the Netherlands. And since those 20 years, we've kept putting more collections into it, collections from abandoned museums or closed museums. So I think we hold collections of 5 different or 6 different museums, and we've been trying to manage all this and to make sure that it stays accessible. But also, what shouldn't we keep and how should we deal with it? And sometimes for a university museum, we get offered the nicest things. So just a few weeks ago, there was a magnificent cupboard. It was very big. It was used in one of our biological facilities in the 19th century. So it was more than 5 meters in length. And we have no space for it. but if we turn it down, it may be thrown away by the department that's now responsible for it, which would be, well, that's breaking our hearts as people who study the history of our university. So how should we deal with it? The toolkit you talked about, would it give me information how to come to a reasoned decision to
Yes. It's the very short answer. Yes, so you're mentioning there the slide. I presume you're mentioning the slide there with the disposal toolkit. Is that
yeah. With the very nice statue nobody wants to throw away, and it says disposal toolkit.
Yes. So, and Sharon, I'm sure will have more to add here, but yes, there are very thorough guidelines and suggested procedures and protocols for museums within the UK that particularly museums that have what is called an accredited status. So they have a recognition of meeting a certain professional standard to have an accredited status. There are particular guidelines that they do need to follow, and that screenshot there of the UK Museums Association Disposal Toolkit and Ethical Toolkit is one of those. But I think maybe one of the interesting things we found through our research is that while these are incredibly useful tools for making these decisions, these are still complex and tricky decisions that involve various forms of labour, including actually emotional labour. We thought, I guess we had a hunch we would find that in households. Speaking from experience, I can find it quite challenging to part with things, but we found this also in museums, despite the kinds of infrastructural support mechanisms, if you like. And that's partly due to go to the slide that Sharon brought up towards the end, the range of different practical considerations and also values that really come into play and might actually push an object out of the museum or variously pull it back in. That's the kind of language that we've spoken about, these decisions in some of our work, and that they can actually come into conflict at times. So the answer is yes, it may help you, but perhaps not. And I can see Sharon wants to add something.
Yeah, it probably helps you to come up with a justification for why you do what you want to do. I would say slightly more skeptically. I mean, I think sometimes, yeah, it does because it's a set of procedures, but we did have some people who were quite skeptical and said, actually, firstly, it makes it harder for us to do things because there's so many layers of paperwork. But secondly, maybe what's often happening is more, you know, because it's such a big deal, especially, you know, deaccession disposal, people want to feel sort of that it's okay. And I mean, we did write about these as semi-magical techniques in a way because of they're sort of, it's not so much about the actual rationality, but it's about how it makes you feel, which is, I think Jenny's point about emotions is really important there too. But were you want to know about deciding whether to acquire things?
Well, yeah, I think that was actually what was happening here. Obviously, we also make the choices of de-accessing. In Dutch, we say ontzamelen, whereas we collect something, we say verzamelen. And if we de-access it, it's ontzamelen. But that's probably because it's already part of the collection of the university. There are some legalities and stuff like that. So it will be hard to throw the cupboard away for the university, I hope. But you never know. Before we continue, I again want to invite the audience to ask questions. There's a chat function in the top right bottom of your screen. It's the purple button. If you click it, just ask a question, and I will ask you to pose the question. And if you don't want to speak in public, I'll ask the question for you. That's not a problem, obviously. But please join the discussion. I wanted to, but before I go to the audience, I wanted to ask or mention something else as well. In the Netherlands, we now have a website, which may be very interesting. And this is because there's a strict protocol for museums that are registered as a museum to de-access collections. We have to ask the ministry, is this part of the collection of the Netherlands? And if the ministry says, well, that's okay, you can de-access it, we have to ask other museums, do you want to have it? This is all regulated. But then still, at the end of this entire, this long trajectory, we can go to a website where we can actually sell it. So this is a combined effort of the museums in the Netherlands where we can offer parts of our collections to the audience, and you can buy it as a member of the audience. Do you know of any other examples that?
Wow, that's very interesting. So members of the public can buy a disposed deaccessioned object.
Yeah.
I've not heard of that specifically in the UK. I mean, I've heard of one initiative that I thought was quite an interesting one a few years ago was a website. I don't know if you have the equivalent in the UK. It's called Free Cycle, where people will give away things, and it's about recycling, reusing, redistributing, basically a way to get rid of things after you've done a declutter at home, perhaps. And someone started a kind of museum equivalent of that, but it wasn't, as far as I'm aware, used for disposed collection items. It was more used for kind of awkward objects, the kind of things that end up in museum storage, like exhibition furniture or exhibition props. And so that was a way to maybe recycle those kinds of things. But they have a funny status because they're not collection items. But Sharon, have you heard of anything like that in other national contexts?
Actually, I was just being amused by all the people wanting to get on that site. everybody's there. But there's the case where some of the objects get given to artists to work with them, and then sometimes sold. I don't think that goes through one particular site, though. I'm not sure, because I bet everybody really want that one. But yeah, I mean, there's some creative ideas coming along, and I suppose the selling them in the end, yeah, the money goes back to the museum. Maybe that's a very good model and strategy.
Well, clearly, a lot of what's been offered is stuff like stuff you use to have it on display, so actual displays as well. But there are some very nice objects there, especially from museums that go bust in one way or another, because that's always difficult. For us as a museum, we have the collections of a museum from Deventer, which specialized in tropical agriculture. So I can build an entire rice farm if I want, with small dolls, and explain everything. But it's very hard to make that exhibit as a university museum. But we can also not throw it away because it's part of academic heritage as we see it. So yeah, it's not that easy. Fortunately, we're getting a few questions, and I want to invite Nama de Roux to open your mic and camera, if you're okay with that, and ask the question you actually posed in because it's interesting, and it's also something. Nama.
Yes, can you see me?
Well, I can hear you, and I think, yeah, we can also see you now.
Yeah, all right. Well, my questions is, do different countries have other ways of handling their heritage, and how do they make choices? Do they all do it in the same way? Do they have manuals? Or, I mean, you made a nice manual, I'll call it a manual, but does it differ in different countries? That's my question.
All right, thank you. So,
Who wants
please.
to take this? Sharon, do you want to start?
I could begin. I mean, this is not something we looked at in great detail, but we did find, for example, that these practices of these significance assessments were very much begun in Australia, and they have travelled quite differentially. So, as somebody working in Germany, the idea of Entsammeln, so it's rather like the Dutch, is really much more taboo than it has become now in the UK, for example. And there are certain specific practices that are different, and including if we're thinking about cases where the systems are not so regulated, we do know, and it can be in all sorts of parts of the world, there are places where people go and get the objects out and use them for ritual purposes, or because they need to get about and so on. And that model of keeping things in perpetuity is not one that we necessarily find in all societies, but it's kind of come along with that model of the museum. But kind of looking at that very systematically is something actually that we would quite like to do in some future research. So if there's others here who want to join us, let us know.
Okay, well, thank you very much.
Thank you, Nama.
Thank you.
Welcome.
I think Andrea, you also have a complicated question as well. So it would very much be best if you asked it.
Okay,
Yes.
I'm turning things on. Yeah, it's a complicated question, and maybe also a predictable question. And I'm sure one that you've been getting, especially in the context of the UK. And I ask this as an artist who works with historical photo collections that either are on the African continent, and then they are very often related to the colonial past or the result of it, or are in, well, one at the moment a collection that is in the Netherlands and the result of a missionary kind of missionary scientific approach. It's a complicated collection. But so from that position, I'm wondering whether there is, from your findings, anything to learn or to particularly relate to the discourse, the complicated discourse on the decolonizing of museum collections that is very much going on at the moment. Yeah.
Yeah, it's one of the big issues probably in the museum world. So.
Well, I mean, I can. Sharon would be far better to talk about this, given the emphasis of the research centre that she leads. I suppose, you know, so it wasn't a primary focus of the research. Probably the first thing to say.
But
actually, surprisingly, I mean, now that you've asked it, it's a really obviously a really important question and interesting to ask. And actually, one of the interesting things is perhaps it didn't come up maybe as much as what we might expect, given the prevalence of the discourse. I think the way, one way that our research might link in explicit ways to these wider questions is around, in terms of keeping objects. Oh, am I still going? My screen's just gone crazy.
I think it's okay. I think this happens to everybody. Yeah.
Okay, that's fine.
We can hear you.
Yeah. The sort of the prevalence of keeping for stories and objects being able to tell rich and diverse stories that speak to hidden, overlooked histories, diversification of identities. So I think that's kind of one link where it would connect. Sorry, the screen is doing strange things and it's sort of
I'm seeing you then. Yeah.
So I'm making 2 points really. One is it probably was less prevalent than what we might expect, which I think is quite interesting in itself. But two, in terms of rationales for keeping, really the prevalence of being able to have collections and objects that tell multiple rich and diverse stories, and particularly those of hidden histories and kind of what has been, overlooked. But Sharon's probably got much more sensible things to say than I have, given her research centre's
It
emphasis.
sounded sensible to me already, but Sharon, perhaps you have something to add?
I'm sure I never have more sensible things to say. Yeah, no, I think Jenny's point about the question of diversity, and we can see that as one dimension of decolonization, that absolutely was a very, what's the right word? It was a discourse that was absolutely there. And it was one of the reasons why people would sometimes say, all this stuff we've got already, how can we collect in a more diverse way today when we have all this other kind of stuff? So that's one way in which it linked in. Because of the kinds of museums that we looked at, we mostly were not dealing with colonial objects. I mean, it was more these sort of stuff of everyday life in that way. I have to say, I have sometimes thought there is something weird, though, about if you put together restitution debates with these things of decluttering, because you could say, why hang on to all these things when you've got so many of them? And if other people want any of them, yeah, there's one way. But of course, the counter argument would then be that might look a very bad sort of mode of restitution if it was just because you want to make more space in your basement, or maybe not.
Yeah, well, it would not necessarily be a decolonizing gesture, would it be? I mean, a few colonies have been set up with that, with a similar sort of line of thought. Anyway, yeah. No, I guess that I don't know if you know, and that's my last eye, and then I'll shut up again. There's this project by Paul Bazou, Museum Affordances. I guess this idea of affordances of future heritage, sort of projecting that out there might be, or I can imagine that now comes up as I listen to you as a.
Absolutely.
As we talk to each other. I'm part of that project, and it's an absolutely fantastic project. And
it is.
And there are re-entanglements, people.
Yeah.
I think the reactivation of collections was a really big theme that came out of our research as well. So looking at how we can reactivate stored collections, reinvigorate them, if you like, and I think that has connections to the kind of museum affordances work as well, albeit in different ways. But yeah, making collections active again whilst they're in storage was absolutely a huge theme in terms of keeping.
Yeah. Okay, thank you.
All right. And thank you very much as well. I think, Susanne, I'm not sure. I think your question may have been answered or not. If you're specifically interested in the cultural differences, I don't want to decide this for you, actually, because we have some time, and so I could invite you to come up.
My question was answered. Thank you very much.
Okay, that's okay. Thank you, Susanne. Then I would like to invite Fleur Dijkstra, because you had a great question, and I will say something about Doris and Naylor later. But first, Fleur. Oh, you don't have a webcam or a microphone available, it says, so I'll ask your question. What is your view on the increasing digitization of museum collections? Is it a viable alternative to giant warehouses, or rather a detrimental to the preservation of information in the long run? So should we throw away everything we have digitized, or should we handle it in a different fashion? Perhaps that's a bit too much, but
no, it's a great question,
Jenny.
Well, I think so we often get asked about the digital, and I think the first thing to say is we didn't kind of set out hiving it off as a specific focus in the study. We wanted to just, as we said in our presentation, remain open to seeing where and how these things kind of emerged on the ground. The digital was present, again, perhaps maybe less than what one might anticipate. I think in terms of our participants' views and our participants' perspectives in terms of the curators and museum workers that we've visited and spoke to, is it's not seen as an easy, simple fix to this problem. It comes with its own set of profusion headaches, digital overload, which I laugh because I think we're all kind of experiencing that a little bit at the moment. It comes with its own conservation risks in terms of being able to maintain and stabilize digital objects with degradation of technology, and if we converted everything to digital in 5 years time, let alone 100 or 200, would it be there? It's not storage free. It doesn't come without environmental impact. Digital storage has an environmental impact. So for those museums who are thinking about issues of sustainability, for example, it can come with its own headaches there. So the sort of short answer is it is there, it is being discussed, it's being used, but I don't think it's seen widely as being a simple, straightforward sticking plaster, if you like. Would that be fair to say, Sharon?
Yeah, Sharon?
No, absolutely. I don't think, but you remember better than me, Jenny, I don't think we came across any museum where they're going, let's just take a photo of it and get rid of the thing.
No, absolutely not.
You've got some examples, have you?
And I think also because that's partly, just to go back to those values that we talked about keeping, there are, the sort of the physical material elements of objects that I think are still very valued as well. So I don't think the digital replica is necessarily seen as
so I actually have an example of this week. We had this portrait of one of the great professors in the history of our university on loan from Geneva. I think it was about 20 years ago. There were very nice pictures taken of this portrait, and we were thinking about printing it out and putting it up on a wall. But as it turns out, we only have the digital copies were preserved, whereas the actual negatives of the photo were kept until 3 years ago. But somebody decided, or 4 years ago, but somebody decided we needed the space and it was thrown away. But the digital copies of 20 years ago obviously aren't good enough to make a print of this. So the actual object is there, but even the negative turns into an object sometimes in the museum world, right? So fortunately, in this day and age, we can just send an email to the museum. We have the portrait from on loan, obviously, and we'll have the high resolution photo within our inboxes in a day or two. But still, it was one of these cases where we do throw things away, and more often I find as a museum director, especially decisions taken in the 1920s and 1950s, now I find very hard to cope with. So some of our nicest objects actually are kept by a museum in Leiden, because in the 1920s and 30s, it was thought a good idea to collect all these important objects in a central point, which if we had them today, I could tell the story of the history of the museum, of the university much better.
Can I, it's really very interesting. It's just made me think another thing to add to the digital as well, actually, is that in terms of the kinds of museums and the kinds of collecting that we're looking at, which is of the contemporary present and recent past, of course, the digital and digital born objects in themselves present a kind of whole nother avenue and potential overload area in terms of, collecting of social media, even things like collecting of, computer games. That's more sort of electronic media, but in terms of digital, it is also with contemporary collecting. That's another way that it was very prevalent. In homes, because of course we worked across different contexts. I think one of the things we found in homes is digital storage, unless it's got an ordering and organization system, often just became really unusable. So, I remember one very memorable interview with a householder telling me about the literally thousands of digital photographs that were on various hard drives and cell phones and CDs and all these different kinds of media, which, you know, there's concerns about preservation risk, but it was just simply not usable or accessible because there was no kind of system there. So yeah, they're in homes as well.
Yeah, I think so. Oh yeah, please.
Oh no, I was just sort of going to add to that, because we had just last week, was it, the first ever tweet was bought by a private collector for this vast amount of money. And I thought, wow, that is extraordinary, really. And then you put that together with, you know, the US Library of Congress, when tweeting began, when Twitter began, its initial aim was to collect every single public tweet. So they started doing this, but then, and actually it was amazing, it was before Trump. That would really have stopped it, but it broke down because it became impossible. And it was partly a legal issue, because anything that's private can't be collected, but people post, you know, send things on, so it didn't work. But yeah, I mean, and I think in general, the digital just adds even more layers to what you can.
I think these automated systems for collecting are really interesting too, as well. So, you know, through our research, we partly learned to kind of like automated sort of, you know, harvesting big data. So, for example, if you're collecting on Twitter, then getting everything with a particular hashtag. So I think that when we're looking at selecting and decisions about keeping, that kind of brings in other nuances that we didn't really have a chance to go down that road in our research, but I think would be really interesting to do so. And there are certainly, you know, other people working in this area as well, doing interesting work.
It touches a little, I think, on the comment Doris made. And Doris, perhaps you want to add something to that, or say something. If you can turn it into a question, I invite you to actually pose it. But it also touches on something I've been thinking all along now, which is the nicest objects in our collections are the rarest objects. Whenever we have a lot of them, I actually don't find them that interesting. But if there's just one of them, or just, then I want to showcase them, obviously. So, Doris.
Could I just quickly? So, in terms of rarity, is that only defined by singularity then?
Well, no, I don't think that's entirely true. The reason why I thought of it was I've just written a book on a person from the 18th century, and actually the periods of his life I spent most time on were the periods I knew less about, a little about. So I really started digging into that because I wanted to know, and I think this is also true for the collections to a certain extent, obviously. Doris.
Yeah, hello. Well, in this collection that I was in, which was natural history, and there, you would say, like, they had loads and loads of eggs from let's say sparrows from different places in different years. You'd say, well, if you collect 10, you know what they look like. But in this case, they could do research and determine that the eggshells became thinner once a certain type of pollution started coming up. So in that case, they needed the loads and loads and loads of them to do their research. And I was thinking, how would this maybe link to
it's such an excellent question, because what that's making me kind of connect with in terms of where some of the arguments that Sharon and I have made is that profusion is not simply defined by quantities of stuff. It's not like a nominal sum of you have 200 eggs and suddenly you're profuse compared to having 20. It's not simply about quantities of things, but it is about when it is experienced or felt to be too much. And that's where it starts getting complex, because that's when these underlying motivations and values and assumptions about what and what not to keep come into play, and that's what defines something as being too much or not, as does also practicalities like storage, right? If you've got 2,000 eggs and you can't fit them in 3 shelves, then that's storage. The infrastructure, it's leaking out, to go back to those initial definition or discussion of word. So there is a partly a kind of practical containing it all element. So thank you for that, because I think it is probably important for us to say that one of the key findings was that profusion isn't a kind of nominal quantities issue.
Thank you.
Thank you, Doris. So I have one more question from Lian van der Zon, who doesn't have a camera or microphone. She says, I'd be interested to know if you have come across examples where the choice for disposal or keeping was made by or together with communities outside of a museum.
Do you want to talk to this, Sharon? I'm sure we both could, but you go for it.
I think you might more, but I guess the quick answer is yes, that is something that is happening. I think the case that it came closest to us, or you might think of the one that pops into my mind at first was one in the north of England, where the museum did basically say these are the, we've got this issue, basically opened it all up, we've got this issue, this is what we're thinking of doing, and they discussed that with their local community. So that has been done, but you might have
and the survey that we mentioned actually asked that as one of the explicit questions, and I would have to go back and have a look at the survey, but if my memory serves, it was over what the majority were actually very open to this idea and would like to do much more of that, actually involving public, not only specific communities, but the wider public in these decisions. But there are also still some reservations that come with the kinds of issues we've already talked about, like the connotations of words disposal and these kinds of things, and also just the practicalities of how it works on the ground and things like that. But I think there was definitely a sense that this is something that museums generally would like to do more of.
Yeah, I would love that, actually. And I think it would also add to our value as a museum, but it would also, we would attract different audiences from normal, from day-to-day practice, right? Because
there was an exhibition many years ago in UCL where the University College London did a exhibition of items that were being proposed for disposal, and had made an exhibition and had the public come in and actually vote and give their opinions, which I thought was a really, again, going back to these creative strategies, I thought was really, really interesting. I'm sure a quick internet search for those who are interested would bring it up.
It's famous, actually.
Is it good?
And
sorry,
we do know that, as soon as a museum is threatened with being closed down, or as soon as the stuffed polar bear or whatever it is going to be taken off display, that's when people start getting really, really involved in the museum. So it's probably a great way of actually getting involved.
Well, everybody's still here. Museums have a very hard time. So a lot of museums are actually being threatened at being closed right now. So as soon as you can, please go and visit the museums. The more you visit them, the more actually we have a chance to showcase as many of our objects as we can. I would like to thank you both for a splendid talk. I really learned a lot. And well, that's it for tonight, I think. Thank you very much. And is there anything I still need to say? I always get these assignments when I do stuff like this. Wait, let me have a quick look. No, I think I said almost everything. So Sharon and Jenny, thank you very much, and good night.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thanks
Thank
for having us.
you. And thank you, everybody.
Thank you, everybody.